So let's get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're glad to have you with us. We're going to be in lesson number 6, talking about the spiritual law, page 24 in your book. If you don't have a book, there's some extras in the back. As I mentioned last week, we talked about worship in the wilderness. We talked about the tabernacle, the contents of the tabernacle, these different rooms that we see, and what worship was going to look like while the Israelites were in the wilderness. Now we're officially in the wilderness, we're out of Egypt, and this week we're going to be talking about the spiritual law. So I've kind of divided the law. Obviously, a lot of, when you read this part of the Bible, Exodus through Deuteronomy, a lot of the words, a big portion of the content, right, is laws and rules and details, like we've been talking about in our Sunday morning Bible class as well. That's where we're at kind of in our congregational Bible reading as well. So we're covering a lot of these details, and I've kind of tried to compartmentalize those details into these 3 lessons. This would be lesson 2 of kind of those middle lessons. Last week talking about the way they worshiped, this week talking about the spiritual law, and next week talking about kind of the general laws. I wanted to we'll start off with a prayer in just a second, but I wanted to start off by mentioning, I know in past classes I've had resources to share for people who have been interested, and I appreciate your interest in those things. One thing that I do have for this class, if anyone's interested, you can email me or text me or whatever after class, but it might be helpful if you're interested in kind of diving more into the content of the spiritual law and the general laws that we're going to talk about next week. It's actually a project I did in college, and I took a class on the law of Moses, and so we spent a whole semester talking about the law of Moses and things like that. And for one of our final projects in that class, we had to kind of go through the law and divide it up into different categories. So there's a table of contents, and it not so that you look at work I did in college, but it's interesting to look at the table of contents at least, just to kind of see some of the divisions of these laws: general conduct, justice, protected classes, finances, family law, Nazirite marriage, sexual law, cleanliness, violent crimes, and then spiritual law, which spiritual law would go everywhere from sorcery and black magic and things like that, all the way to sacrifices, holidays, things like that. So if you're interested in that as a resource, again, you can get with me after class and I can send you a PDF or make you a paper booklet if you're so inclined. But we are going to kind of divide those things into these 2 classes to hopefully kind of help us glean what we can from this material. I know reading through ancient legal text can be a little bit of a chore, but there's definitely a lot to learn, so that's what we're going to be doing the next couple of weeks. So let's go ahead and get started with a prayer. Father, we thank you for bringing us here this evening. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be before you and be in your word, learning all the incredible things that we get to learn from Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And help us to learn the lessons that you would have us to learn from your people as they wander through the wilderness, as they try to serve you but often end up serving themselves. Help us to not be like them and always be growing closer to you and serving you the way you want to be served. Thank you again for bringing us here, and take us home safely to our houses later tonight. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I wanted to get started with, as I said, we're on lesson 6, spiritual laws, but just by way of getting started, based off of what you've read in Leviticus and as you've seen in every lesson, we have the text covered and the suggested reading. You'll also, even if you haven't necessarily done any particular reading for this Bible class, you've already seen some of this in the congregational Bible reading, assuming you've been keeping up with that. So it's really nice, like Ben has mentioned this, I've mentioned this, we're going to keep seeing this kind of overlap, but that's really a good thing. So we're seeing these things in both classes, but I have some references here on page 24 in your book about these 3 big words. For next week, you'll notice that the title of the lesson is General Law, Purity, and Justice. We're going to talk more about purity, and we're going to talk a lot about this idea of justice next week. But these three big key words when we talk about spiritual law: purity, holiness, and reverence. Let's start with purity. How would you define that based off of what you read in Leviticus? Richard?
I put set apart by a specific action, and in this case, the altar was purified with the blood of the bull.
Okay, good. So sometimes we see certain things being purified and kind of consecrated. Consecration is another idea that we see where something is set apart for a specific purpose. When we talk about holiness, that these ideas kind of bleed over one into the other. So purity, right? When we think of purity, we think of cleansing, we think of cleanness, right? If something is like pure gold, is you've gotten all the impurities out of it, right? Anything else about purity? What else?
Without defect.
Without defect, right? Okay, so what is God's way of making things pure, or making sure things are pure? We mentioned one with purifying he uses blood, right? Tim, did you have something?
Which seems contradictory. It's cleansing with blood. It says.
Right. Right. When you see ads for like laundry detergent, the one thing that's like impossible to get out of anything is blood, right? It's hard to get blood out of things, and yet when over and over again, starting really here in Exodus and Leviticus and in these books, we see, well, and starting in Genesis for that matter, you see this idea of blood cleansing things. But what else? When we think of biblical purity or purity in the sense of the spiritual law, let's move on to holiness, because I think purity is kind of broad, but holiness is more a specific religious term, right? Specifically used in a religious context. And I want to read in Leviticus chapter 19. In Leviticus 19, we kind of have more context given for what some of these concepts look like, specifically talking about the Lord being holy. In Leviticus 19, and starting in verse 1, we read, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols to make for yourselves any god of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that it may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or on the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted. It will not be accepted, and everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people." So we see this concept time and time again of different people being cut off from the people. We're going to see a lot of punishments, especially next week when we talk about different punishments for different crimes. And one of the punishments that we see really commonly is this idea of being cut off from the people. But notice when we think of the word profane, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Profane language.
Profane language, right? Profanity, right? JD?
I think from the religious aspect, something that's profane perhaps could be synonymous with something that's blasphemous, like perhaps these idols, for example, saying that they are the gods and that this one God cannot be with one God.
Exactly, right. So when we think of idols, idol worship, a lot of the specific practices that go into idol worship, some of the sacrifices, some of the rituals are very profane, right? And we think of profane maybe in a literal sense as dirty, right? Things that are holy and clean and pure, and all these concepts that we're seeing kind of come together. If it's not pure and it's not clean, then it's profane or vulgar or something like that. And so we see this concept over and over again throughout the law, where God wants his people to be set apart. So if we think about, I know we've talked about purity in a physical sense, right? We think about purity as far as cleanliness and things like that. Do you think purity and cleanliness and holiness, do you think all of this is just hygienic? Do you think this is just God wanting his people to wash their hands and not mess with it? So what do you think is the rationale or the point, I guess, behind all this language of don't profane me, don't profane my name, don't profane yourselves? JD?
In regards to purity as a whole, it would be a condition that they needed to maintain their condition of being God's people and not turning away from everything that he has provided for them and established for them within the rules and laws that he has given to them through Moses.
Exactly, right. He's given them these laws for a reason, and so he expects them, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it right. And if you're going to be this people he talks about them as, you are a people set apart for my purpose. So if you're going to be, if I'm going to make you different than everyone else, you're going to have to act different than everybody else. Ben and then Dad.
Verse 29 of Leviticus 19, do not profane your daughter by making her a harlot in the margin, for profane and to degrade. So that gives us another insight with that too. But the fact that the Lord says, I am holy, even the hygienic instructions and laws and washing of hands and things like that, I think he's still helping them to see who he is. So this idea of holiness, the fact that he is holy and what that actually means, for them, learning more about him as God. So this could also be different ways that he's showing them that there has to be this clear distinction.
Exactly, and with that example of profaning your daughter or women being profaned, or in these different contexts, the word profane, like Joanna mentioned, and I'm sure many of us were thinking it with profanity and profane language, it's, that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. And so over and over again throughout these laws, we see this idea in not only your conduct with each other, but your conduct with your spouse, and your conduct just in every facet of your life is to be pure and holy and set apart. Dad?
It makes me think about, that he wants to make sure they remember they're set apart. That they're and it's kind of like when we tell our kids that when they go out somewhere, you say, remember who you are. And I think that's what God's trying to get across to them, remember who they are.
Right. That's very common for parents to tell their children, remember who you are, right? If I were to ask you what's the one piece of advice you would want your kids to be, especially those of you that have adult children, you want your kids to, when they leave your house, you want them to remember who they are, right? Remember how you raised them, remember the things you've taught them. And so it makes sense that God would expect, as the Israelites are interacting with other nations, you're not going to act like other nations. You're not going to be like other people. You're not like other people because I have claimed you, I've purified you, I've brought you through this process in your mind. Joanna?
I think God is setting a very clearly defined boundary that he is very serious about, that the worship of Jehovah is a serious matter. And the lines are not to be crossed. Because there are degrees of dirtiness, there are degrees of every kind of little thing, there's degrees of profane language even. But there is a clear boundary of what is pure and what is holy and what is reverent. When Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire, he said, I will not have you profane my name at all. There is no deviation from what I told you to do. So I think that's why he put that very clear line for them.
Exactly, right. Because not only, there's a couple things there. One is, when you think about God's character, God doesn't have flaws, right? We know that. And in making his people holy, we mentioned a couple weeks back that if you were to define holiness, how would you define it? And we talked about where God is. God's essence, right, where God's presence is what makes things holy and is the definition of holy, right? So for God to be with these people, they have to be holy. If something is not holy, God is not there. God is separated from that thing, right? And so if they're gonna maintain this purity of character and this status, if you will, as the chosen nation of God, then they're going to have to maintain that holiness and that purity. And another thing I wanted to mention is this idea of mixtures. There's a few laws as you kind of read through, even the kind of general laws, not laws that sound necessarily like they're outwardly spiritual, laws about like mixing fabrics together or things like that, the ways things are mixed together. And it would be easy to think, like if we in our Constitution or if in Texas law had laws about not putting certain fabrics together, we would think, why is that on the books? Like why is there a law about that? And we might think that when we look at biblical law as well. But again and again and again, and in every facet of their life, even down to how their fabric is woven, I want this people to be pure. And especially when it comes to the priestly garments and different things like that, you're not to mix. You're not to mix with foreign women. You're not to mix different fabrics together. All these different things to where it's that 100% purity, right? And because they're reflecting God's character, right? We as Christians, we want to be Christ-like. We want to reflect God. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ, right? We're all trying to be like Jesus. We're all trying to be like God, right? And so that's kind of what you see portrayed in these laws, which goes back to reverence, right? We've talked about reverence as kind of an idea of healthy respect. How else would you define reverence, or where does reverence tie in here? JD?
When I think of reverence, I think of perhaps the highest form of respect for, in a physical sense, a person, or in this case, for God, for just his sheer power, what he's done. Israelites, at the end of the day, reverence and respect are one and the same.
Exactly. It's just that utmost form of respect, right? That healthy respect for authority. We've mentioned that as well in past classes, how in a lot of ways, especially in the United States, because, power to the people, right? And we have our rights and our liberties, and we should be thankful for those things. But sometimes that can kind of lead to an extreme view of, well, I can say whatever I want and I can do whatever I want. And again, that kind of rejection of authority as a whole. But reverence, especially with God, is that healthy respect of, I know this is the way God has set things up. I know God is in control. I know God is sovereign and omnipotent and all those things. God is the authority in my life. And so I'm going to have that utmost healthy, fearful respect that God demands and requires, right?
Say awe to AWE.
Right.
Who he is with this idea of reverence. Because of what he's done at Mount Sinai, how certain people are going to die if they practice certain things. It's pretty big. There's a lot of fear there with just his power and his standard with who he is.
Exactly. That concept of awe at just the force that God is capable of. Thinking back to the Exodus, we're going to keep going back to what those signs that God did, all the plagues that God did, and the fact that he's able to split a river in half in a moment, right? And he's able to tell masses of frogs and lice and flies and all these animals where to go, and he's able to wipe out a nation overnight, and he's able to do all of these things that it's just a demonstration of force, right? And go head to head with Pharaoh, who in many ways was the most powerful person in his day, and Pharaoh doesn't stand a chance at all. So, and that's where that fear comes from, right? Fear can be a good thing. God can use fear. And that's not to say we're so petrified of God that we don't have an intimate relationship with him, but that healthy fear of, I know what God is capable of because I've seen it. Joanna, did you have something?
Without a proper reverence towards God, we cannot draw near to him. You think about when they were transporting the ark in the cart, and Uzzah touched it, and God smote him dead. To us, we think, well, that's an extreme reaction to that. He was trying to do something good. That's how we would justify it, right? He was trying to do something right. But again, God gave them a firm boundary of how to transport the ark. and they violated it. And that's the same God. The law changed, but God did not change. So if we do not have a healthy reverence for him, we will not draw near to him. Because you can't accidentally find him like that. Because, Jeremiah says our heart will lead us astray. All these things, all these warnings, that you can't do this on your own. You have to use his word and have that healthy fear of him.
Exactly. Sometimes people kind of make this false distinction between, like, the God of the Old Testament is really, judgmental and serious, and then the God of the New Testament is a different way. That's not true. Jesus of Nazareth, the character that you see in Jesus of Nazareth, and the love and the compassion that you see, but also Jesus didn't mince words either. Like he spoke pretty harshly and pretty firmly as well. And so both can be true, right? That's what makes God perfect, right? He's ultimately loving, but loving not in a doormat weakness type of way, right? He's supremely loving in a perfect, as 1 Corinthians 13 describes it, way, right? What else about reverence before we get into the holy days? Anything else? Okay. One thing I want to hit on before we get into some of the holy days and some of the types of sacrifices is, if you'll look at question number 5 on page 25 in your book, what role does this, I just thought this was interesting as you kind of put some of these laws together, and this isn't just in the spiritual law, we're going to see this again in the general laws as well. But this idea of realizing guilt, it talks about accidental sins that people aren't aware that they're committing, but then it talks about when they realize their guilt, or if they do something without realizing their guilt. What did you pick up on looking at those verses and thinking about this idea of the conscience, or when we sin accidentally and when they were to realize their guilt? One of the references we have there is Leviticus 4:13, if you want to turn there. Leviticus 4 and verse 13. If the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they do any of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, and they realize their guilt, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, the assembly shall offer a bull from the herd for a sin offering and bring it to the front of the tent of meeting, and the elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the head of the bull. And so it goes into how to sacrifice the bull. But this unintentional sin, and then the realization of guilt, and then in Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 4, Leviticus 5:4 says, "Or if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it, he realizes his guilt in any of these. When he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as a compensation for the sin he has committed a female of the flock." So it goes into the offering that's to be the sacrifice that is to be sacrificed for an unintentional sin. But why do you think God makes a distinction between intentional sin and unintentional sin?
Well, there's clearly a difference between the two, and I think there's something there to be said about this growth of understanding what it is that God wants. And not all sin may be intentional or on purpose, as we're seeing here. And maybe it's also looking at the matter of the heart. If something is intentional, there's planning, there's decisions, there can be deceit and things like that. So you do see a contrast between the two. And then you also see a path forward, even with the unintentional sin, how there's still going to be guilt associated with it and some kind of sacrifice. I also thought about Hebrews, because that's what a Hebrew writer talks a lot about. There still remain a consciousness of sin. And I think there's something there going with the conscious, with the distinction of what the blood of Jesus does for us when our sins are forgiven, and what was still missing here.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. We know what it's like to consciously do something wrong, to think to ourselves, I know this is wrong, I know this is going to be a bad idea, I know this isn't going to work out for me, probably, but I'm going to do it anyway. But we also probably have had moments where we've said something to our spouse, or we've said something at work, or we've done something, and we kind of come around to it later and think, what have I done? How did that happen? And we think about this realization of guilt. But I think it says a lot about God's grace, because we think about, it would be a completely different picture of God if every time anybody sinned, even if it was unintentional, they were struck dead, right? Which sin is sin, right? God's justice is perfect, but you see that idea of, I know that you are an imperfect people. I created you. I'm well aware of what you're capable of as far as sin is concerned, but you also see him provide a path out even before Jesus, right? We see this fulfilled in Jesus, of course, with all these sacrifices, but you see that idea of even when we don't realize what we're doing, even the sins that we don't realize that we've committed, for them at least, there's this way out of realizing that there's a rupture there, right? God's not just going to say, oh, well, it was an accident, I understand, it's not that big of a deal, I'll just turn a blind eye to it. There still has to be a sacrifice involved, but God, in his grace and in his mercy, provides a way out. Tim?
Yes, and God doesn't change the way that he is then and now. He defines, and I thought Ben did a good job explaining this, he defines what this is and why he put it in there was very important for us, because without having this description of an unintentional sin, well, there's a lot of people today that might have discussions of, well, I didn't know, and now I do know, but you're still held accountable for that. And there's a lot of sin that people will have, and you can't, marriage, divorce, remarriage, and all that kind of thing. That's something that comes out and said, okay, well, you're still held accountable for what God expects of us, no matter if you knew right or wrong at that time. They were still having to make sacrifices. If they didn't make sacrifices, they're in big trouble. Just like us, we've got to fix where we were at.
Exactly. That issue of intentionality and that ruptured relationship or that broken relationship with God has always been a problem. But still, God has always, again, in his mercy and in accordance with his character, provided a path out or a path back to him, if you will. Right? Stu, did you have something? Yeah.
The reality is that in that situation, it still required blood. And with our sin, it still requires blood. Requires the blood of Christ. It's interesting to me, though, that in Numbers there's a parallel passage that talks about unintentional sin of the congregation. And then in the very next section, it talks about executing a man who willfully broke the Sabbath by collecting sticks, right? So even in that story, God is making a distinction between somebody who's willfully, understanding, knowingly sinning. He required execution for that, relative to right before that was talking about unintentional, still requiring sacrifice, still requiring blood, but we see God's mercy in allowing that to happen without them paying the ultimate price in their life.
Exactly. We're going to see a lot of this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Some verses even go on to say fracture for fracture, eye for, like any little thing that is done to a person is that a person does to someone else is done to them, and we see that in a lot of different ways that we'll talk about next week. But that's a great example of that Sabbath breaker. We're going to talk about him in lesson 8. And just thinking about the steep price that we see people pay, and the steep price that God requires for people who knowingly choose to say, I know it's the Sabbath, I'm going to go out and do this anyway, or I know that this is wrong, but I'm going to go do this anyway, versus these unintentional sins that we're talking about here. Now, in the last 15 or so minutes, I want to go through the holy days. You see them in question number 2 on page 24 in your book, and you see them really outlined in Leviticus 23. What are some of if we were to just list some of them, what holy days or holidays, if you will, do you see outlined in Leviticus 23? Passover, the big one. What else? Sorry, what? Okay, Yom Kippur. Okay. There's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits. What else? The Day of Atonement, right? Day of Atonement I don't have on this list because we talked about it with kind of the different types of Sabbaths. You can lump that in a few different ways. But we also have the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, and then the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, either way. And so thinking about some of these different holidays, these different holy days, I know we've talked about the Passover, but what is the Passover? How is it celebrated? When is it celebrated? Who can give me a rundown of the Passover? What part of the year is it in? Spring. So their first month. And what day of so it's a week long. It's kind of confusing with the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover. It's a week-long celebration. The Passover feast, right? When we think of the Passover lamb, it's a specific feast within that. The Feast of Unleavened Bread within that week of Passover, right? And what is this going back to? What event? Deliverance, right? The 10th plague, right? Okay, good. So what about the Feast of First Fruits? It's kind of in the name a little bit, right? You see the first fruits given to God, so it's celebrating the harvest. This is still in spring. So one thing that I hadn't realized for a long time is that there's some of these are in spring and some of them are in the fall, right? So the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, again, they're right at the exact same time, and then the Feast of First Fruits is right in there with that, and then the Feast of Weeks. So the Feast of Weeks, how many days later is the Feast of Weeks after Passover? 49/50, right? So it's 7 weeks, so 49 days, but then the next day, so 50 days. So you can remember the Feast of Weeks because it's several weeks later, several months later even. And so that's kind of in the fall of the year. So the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Feast of Booths / Tabernacles would have been in the later part of the year. And they're all, one thing to note about all of them, I know we talked about the Sabbath last week with the Day of Atonement and different things, but these are all days of rest, right? They're all times of not only celebrating the beginning of the harvest, but the end of the harvest, right? And so God sets their whole calendar up, their whole lifestyle really around resting in what God had given them, right? He gives them these blessings. We've talked in past classes about God providing for his people. And so built into their calendar and built into their life schedule really are all these different opportunities for them to rest and take advantage of the success that God had given them. And if you look at, there's one passage I wanted to look at, Leviticus 26. Leviticus 26 famously talks about blessings for obedience and curses or punishments for disobedience from the law of the law. And if you look at Leviticus 26 and starting in verse 3, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last to the time of grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time for sowing. And you shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. I will remove harmful beasts from the land, and the sword will not go through your land. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword. And so it just kind of goes through. Verse 10, you shall eat store long kept, and you shall clear out the old to make way for the new. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not abhor you. And so in these blessings for obedience, you see a lot of that agricultural language, right? They're growing things, and he's saying everything you do will be bountiful. Your families will be bountiful, your crops will be bountiful, the rain will be bountiful, the land will be bountiful. And so you kind of see that that blessing for obedience built into these holidays. All these holidays meant to look back on everything that God had brought them through, and all these different aspects of their deliverance, and all these different aspects of God's provision for them as they enter the wilderness, and as they're coming into potentially coming into the promised land. We know it's not quite going to work out like that, but they have all these days set aside so that they can rest from their labors. They don't have to worry about the crops, like we talked about with the year of Jubilee and the Sabbath years and all these different things. He has so much time built into their calendar for them to look back on the things that God has done for them and the ways that God has blessed them, and be thankful for that. Right, Ben?
Yeah, that's just one big thing. It's interesting how they grumbled early and throughout the journey, but how much God embedded celebration for the people. I mean, in the Feast of Tabernacles is something that's really interesting to me. You know, that's 7 days of, it feels like an exercise in contentment. You're going to go live in those tents again so you can remember what it used to be like. And there's something there, I think, for us. But it is amazing how much celebration they have in a given year, where the glory and focus is on God, celebrating being delivered out of sin. And, there's some application for us. How much do we celebrate our salvation?
Yeah, exactly. It's incredible to think about, because you think about what they would have gone through, and it would be, and with them receiving these laws, it would be easy to think, oh, he's just giving us laws, he's just giving us mandates, almost like he's giving us things to do, and he obviously is giving them laws, but the focus of the laws is to celebrate how blessed they are, and to celebrate the fact that they're free and they're rich and they're bountiful and everything's going well for them, assuming they're obedient to these things. And so it's just kind of the mercy and the grace of God that you see, but then also, if they don't have a good perspective on it, and if they don't follow these things, then obviously it's not serving its purpose, and then they're not going to be blessed with those things. But as you read through those different holy days and what they represent, you see a lot of different types of sacrifices. And so if you were to name the different types of sacrifices, they're really in the first few chapters of Leviticus. If you want to turn to Leviticus chapter 1. What are some types of sacrifices that we see?
Burnt offering.
Okay, burnt offering. What else? Grain offering. Right? What'd you say? Animal, sorry. Okay, animal offerings, right? So we have burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, and then we also have sin offerings and guilt offerings. What's the role of these different offerings? Let's start with a burnt offering. What's the role of a burnt offering?
Purify or atone.
Okay, to purify or atone. And we kind of see that with multiple of the offerings and multiple different types of sacrifices. There's really three that are to help atone for sin. What, other than the burnt offering, what would the other two be? Sin, I think I heard someone else said it, and what else? And guilt, right? So sin, guilt, burnt offering, those are all kind of tied together with this concept of petitioning God to forgive something. When we were talking about unintentional sins a few minutes ago, a lot of those sacrifices that are required in those circumstances are either burnt offerings, sin offerings, or guilt offerings. Again, you see sin and guilt, and you see those different the different animals that are acceptable in those different scenarios. What about a grain offering or a peace offering? Let's start with a grain offering. What's the point of a grain offering? When is that offered? That's in chapter 2.
More of Thanksgiving.
Right, more of Thanksgiving, right? So grain offerings, some of the resources I was looking at earlier today was talking about the grain offerings almost as supplemental offerings. So if you were bringing a sin offering, in some circumstances you could also bring a grain offering. So whether it's an offering in a good time, that's what a peace offering would be. The peace offering would also is also sometimes known as a fellowship offering, so kind of an offering to kind of symbolize a relationship specifically between a person and God. Sometimes peace offerings or fellowship offerings were used to kind of symbolize a covenant, so a relationship between different people. But grain offerings could kind of shift around, if you will, to kind of be included in different circumstances. Ben?
Leviticus 2:13, what's the purpose of seasoning the grain offering with salt? You got any thoughts on that?
I do not. Do you?
I do. I was just curious.
What would you say?
Well, it's the salt of the covenant of your God. I don't know, maybe just emphasize being like a living sacrifice or something like that. I'm not for sure either. But it's curious how salt is used. Sometimes it's used after judgment upon a place. It's mentioned in the gospel, we're supposed to be the salt of the earth, so there's something significant with that. And maybe it's just with the soothing aroma to the Lord.
Yeah, it is different. It is interesting to kind of see how these different things, but again, I think some of that kind of speaks to the detail that's used. He'll in the law will be given certain things that aren't allowed to be involved with the sacrifices. Sometimes things are mandated to be included with the sacrifices. Sean?
I would say, at least in my head, for salt meant something of great importance to them. Salt was worth its weight in gold. We take table salt for a commodity today, but it was the best way to not only season meat, but also to purify things. As if you've ever felt salt get into your own wound, it hurts because it's not medical.
Right.
But I think that's what from maybe a symbol of purity, but also it's worth a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, there definitely would have been a lot more value, like you said. We take it for granted today, but it is interesting to think about these different things. Another cross reference I have is Numbers 18:19. It says, "All the holy contributions that the people of Israel present to the Lord, I give to you, to your sons and daughters, as a perpetual due. It is a covenant of salt forever before you." Before the Lord, for you and your offspring with you. So apparently some commentators believe that salt is a symbol of kind of perpetuity, maybe that preservation factor. I'm not exactly sure. But I have a couple of charts. That's probably, I don't know if that's hard to see from in the back. Maybe as I said before, I'd be more than happy to share this PowerPoint with you. But this is just kind of a rundown of the burnt offering, the grain offering. And so you kind of see these different verses in Leviticus where it's not only laid out what to do, but the context in which it is to be used. But then you also see these portions given to God, the priests, and the people. But I wanted to end with this. This is designed by, I don't know who R.K. Campbell is, but he designed this chart, and it's interesting to see, obviously you see the cross there and these different offerings in the Old Testament, these 5 different types of offerings, but specifically that focus you see in the middle with the chain that combines the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the peace offering, all of them being voluntary offerings. So these offerings are meant to be voluntary, right? Obviously some of them are mandated in certain instances, right? It's not that you just get to willy-nilly decide what you're going to sacrifice when. But it is interesting that as God mandates these different offerings, you see those ideas come up of reverence. You're going to revere me, you're going to respect me, you're going to respect my law, you're going to be a pure people. Even when you sin unintentionally, even if it's accidental, that still requires blood, like we've talked about. But I want you to want to have a relationship with me. And this is what it's going to take. These are the laws that you're going to have to follow in order to be a people that are pure and set apart and pleasing to me. And then we see that idea multiple times of the sweet savor or the sweet smelling aroma, like we've talked about as well. where as these different, when we think of things that smell good, I know we've talked about this in different talks and things in recent weeks, but when you think of things that smell good, you don't think of burnt offerings, right, or burning animal parts, right? But reverence to God smells good and feels good and is good, right? And with these different offerings and these different sacrifices and the purposes of them, ultimately you see fulfillment in the cross and that voluntary offering that did all of these things for us, right? We'll pick up next week with the general law. Thank you for your participation. Thanks.